Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting International Carnivorous Plant Society's webinar. My name is Kenny Coogan. I'm the Education Director for the Society, and today we have Laurie Hamon, who's going to be doing a presentation on insects as friends and food, Pollination Ecology of Venus flytraps, and this is part of our monthly webinar series for the ICPS, and we are a group of 1,400 paid members. We have people from all over the world. We have growers who are growing plants on their windowsill, all the way up to scientists and researchers who are climbing mountains and going into the Amazon basin to discover new carnivorous plants. We have one more webinar coming up in December of 2024. And then we have a couple of webinars coming up in 2025. We like to have at least one a month, but recently we've been having more. And the way that we get more webinars is by you contacting me and letting me know about a scientist or a topic that you are interested in, and I would be happy to research that for you. And in addition to our monthly webinars, we have a giant celebration. It's coming up on May 7th of May 2025. That is the first Wednesday of May. And that is going to be World Carnivorous Plant Day. World Carnivorous Plant Day is always the first Wednesday in May. So the date changes, but the day of the week is always the same. And it is the 5th anniversary of the World Carnivorous Plant Day, which means you can go to our YouTube channel or our Facebook or Instagram channel, and you can see the last 4 years of World Carnivorous Plant Day, where conservationists and people who are cultivating carnivorous plants from all over the world contribute videos. So we have this huge library of knowledge, and it is all for free. To celebrate the 5th anniversary of World Carnivorous Plant Day, I am looking for presenters to make either 1-minute videos or videos that are up to 10 minutes long about the number 5. So I'm looking for 5 tips on how to grow sundews on a windowsill, or 5 places in Portugal to see carnivorous plants, or 5 ways to propagate a carnivorous plant. So if you're interested in participating, you can send me an email at kenny@carnivorousplants.org, and we will love for you to contribute to the 5th annual World Carnivorous Plant Day. And also, if you're interested in being one of our monthly webinar speakers, you can also send me a link or information to that email. And without further ado, we are going to now listen to Laurie's presentation. And if you're attending this live, thank you so much. And if you have questions for her, you can type them into the chat box below, and I will read all of the best questions to her at the end. And with that, thank you so much, Laurie, and we are looking forward to it.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Kenny. I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully you're able to see that. Speak up if you can't.
Yep, perfect.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Laurie Hamon. I am speaking to you in my capacity as a former PhD student at NC State. I graduated in 2022. I currently work for the state in North Carolina as a pollination biologist, but this is sort of what I did my research on for quite a while, and I'm still publishing. And I focused on the pollination ecology of Venus flytrap. I'm speaking to you from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is in the center of the state of North Carolina. And as you may already be aware, Venus flytrap grows natively in North and South Carolina. So I'm going to speak really briefly about a couple of studies and just talk about the fascinating floral ecology of this plant. So as I mentioned, I'm going to mainly be speaking on two topics here related to this plant's reproduction. One is I'm going to talk a little bit about a study looking at the effects of the time since last burn on the floral ecology of this plant. And then in the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit about how insects as prey and insects as pollinators limit the reproductive potential of this plant. So, as you are probably all very much aware, pollination is an essential part of many plants' lives. It is essentially the transfer of pollen, that male part, to the stigma, the female part of the flower. It's a strategy for sexual reproduction, which is important for making sure there's still genetic diversity and resiliency within plants. And over 88% of flowering plants globally are pollinated by animals. So an actual animal, a mobile vector besides wind or water, is doing that work of getting that pollen from point A to point B. Despite how important pollination ecology is and how important pollination is to plants staying alive and persisting, there's actually many plants where we know very little about how they're pollinated, who pollinates them, how the flowers develop, things like that. And this is especially concerning in the case of rare plants, which, as you know, many carnivorous plants are rare or declining. And this is concerning because, especially for rare plants, those plant pollinator interactions, those connections between plants and their pollinators, can be disrupted for those plants that have fragmented or disjunct or low density plant populations like we see in a lot of rare plants. And this sort of mismatch, this disconnection between plants and their pollinators can lead to inbreeding depression and low reproductive output and ultimately lower abundance, which can have ramifications for the conservation of these species. So frequently pollination and reproduction is understudied in rare plants in the wild. And I have this example, Michaux's sumac, which also occurs in southeastern North Carolina. It has separate male and female individuals, and sometimes those female individuals aren't getting the pollen that's required. This was a study done and published in 2019. So it's these little clues of finding out, how rare plants are getting the pollen that they need and where are those connections disrupted between plants and the insects they depend on. So I studied this in Venus flytrap specifically, which everyone probably globally is familiar with, and especially folks that are tuning into this talk, probably sick of hearing about Venus flytrap maybe because it's such a celebrity. My favorite quote about Venus flytrap was a response from Linnaeus to a paper from the first European describer, Ellis, who suggested this plant was carnivorous, and Linnaeus has said that wouldn't be possible because such a thing would be against the order of nature as willed by God. I love that quote. I think it's very metal and hardcore. There have been thousands of papers on how this plant does its trapping, which are all wonderful essential papers. But interestingly, we know a lot less about its ecology in the wild, how it thrives and survives in its native habitat. So natively, flytrap has very restricted range, occurring in southeastern North Carolina and just a little bit of northeastern South Carolina. And even in this small sort of pocket of endemism, it's declined over time, it used to be more frequent further inland and increasingly sort of more concentrated on the coast of North Carolina within about 50 miles of Wilmington. So areas, those counties that are dark greens are ones that still have what we consider good populations, and those ones that are in warm colors, orange and red, are ones where there was previously Venus flytraps, but are now considered areas where flytraps are considered historic or outright eliminated. And also mention that this comes from some of the major threats, chiefly fire suppression. So Venus flytrap, like many plants in this ecosystem and many carnivorous plants generally, depends on fire to eliminate competition. These threats also come from development in the area. This is the human population in this area is rapidly increasing. And to somewhat of a lesser degree, but it's no less important, poaching. So I think this is maybe familiar, especially to people who grow this plant. But when I was studying this what was a surprise to a lot of people when I would tell them what I was studying is they didn't know that it had a flower, and indeed it does. It grows maybe a foot and a bit above the traps themselves on this long extended scape. Each inflorescence has as few as 2, sometimes 20 some odd flowers, but usually an average about 10, 11 flowers of these understated but still beautiful 5-petaled white flowers. And shortly prior to my starting working on the species, hitherto the pollinators for this species were not known. So a paper came out in 2018 finally describing the pollinators in the wild of this species. So in its native range, it's chiefly visited by sweat bees and a suite of beetles, but we would consider this a generalist pollination scheme. Many, many different things love feeding on the nectar and pollen of Venus flytrap. And this study also found that there's very minimal overlap between what insects are getting caught in the traps and which ones are visiting the flowers. So we would say that Venus flytrap is very good at not eating its own pollinators. There's 2 separate communities of insects visiting these 2 different parts of the flowers. And where that overlap does occur, so we kind of zoom in there, that little overlap, and you can see at the bottom right, there's a handful of things that both were caught in the traps and visited the flowers, but it's sort of happenstance things like the occasional ant or crab spider that was found on the flower, or a buckeye butterfly larvae that was found in the traps. It's not a very significant overlap. The major players are sort of separated. And so when I came in, an initial question I had was, first off, how pollen limited is Venus flytrap? And when I say pollen limited, I mean, to what degree is reproduction in this species in the wild actually limited by the quantity or quality of pollen that receives? Because that can give us some insights into how important insects are for the reproduction of the species. Sometimes some species are a little more resource limited, where the amount of pollen isn't necessarily the limiting factor. It's other things at play. So I just wanted to ask a basic initial question: is it pollen limited? I also interested in to what degree fire management influences the reproduction and pollinator community of this species. So I was asking, how does the time since the last time a flytrap population was burned influence the morphology, flower community, flower visitor community, and pollen limitation of Venus flytrap? And so to do this, we selected 8 sites that were about a month post-burn to upwards of 2 and a bit, 3 years post-burn. Um, and in each of those flytrap sites, we selected a number of plants, and we chose 2 flowers from each of those plants, and we did 2 things. One, we left 1 flower as an open pollinated control, which means we just let that be naturally pollinated. And then the other flower, we sort of pollinated it by hand to saturation. Basically, what is the platonic ideal of the most amount of pollen that the flower can receive? And then we compared the seed set between those that were pollinated naturally and those that received the maximum amount of pollination. And we would expect that if a plant was not receiving the pollen it needs, if it was had low visitation by pollinators, we would expect there to be a large difference between that open pollinated control and the one that we were hand pollinating. We also did a number of things at these sites. We recorded some plant traits, number of flowers, how tall that scape was, the number of traps. We recorded information about the density and abundance of fly traps at those sites, and we also collected some of the insects that were visiting the flowers. And so we looked at how that time since burn correlates or relates to these different traits in the flowering community. So some of the major things we found was that the number of traps decreased with increasing time since last burn, which, if you know the relationship with fly traps and fire, would seem to make sense that over time they're less vigorous. As you increase the amount of time since the last burn, they're getting overshaded. They maybe have less resources to put out new traps, things like that. So we see that relationship here with the days since last burn and the number of traps decreasing over time. We also did observe evidence of pollen limitation in this species. So those flowers that we pollinated to saturation produced about 8% more seeds than those that were naturally pollinated that we left alone, which suggests, at least for this season that we were working in this population, there was evidence of pollen limitation, that maybe these plants could stand to reproduce more if they were receiving better pollination. Another thing we observed is that the diversity of that pollinator community for Venus flytrap was highest in sites that had intermediate time since last burn. So those sites that had been freshly burned, or those sites that had been a long time since the last burn, had lower pollinator diversity for flytraps compared to those where it was a medium amount of time. And from this study, some of the major takeaways were that, as we might expect, the number of traps per plant was decreasing over time since last burn. It suggests these plants are being limited by the amount of light as time increases. And we observed that this plant can exhibit pollen limitation, which suggests how important insects are to its reproduction. But something I neglected to mention is that we didn't witness a variation in the amount of pollen limitation between these sites of varying burn history, at least not in the place where we did this. So that was sort of initial foray into pollen limitation in this plant, the reproductive history of this plant in the wild, and how it relates to management. Another thing that we were interested in was, okay, so there's some evidence here from the fact that it's pollen limited that pollinators play an important role in the reproductive output of this plant. They're potentially a limiting factor. But what about the insects that are coming to its traps? How does that limit reproduction? And for carnivorous plants, that's an interesting dilemma and question to talk about. This is sometimes called the carnivore's dilemma or pollinator-prey conflict. There is, sort of hypothetical debate and some evidence here and there that some carnivorous plants may have this thing called pollinator-prey conflict, where there's a trade-off between catching your own pollinators and your reproductive output. But in order for us to show for a specific species that there is pollinator-prey conflict happening, we need to demonstrate two things. We need to demonstrate that there is an overlap between the species of insect that are pollinating versus those being caught as prey. Plus, we need to observe a cost, a decline in reproductive output or growth, a cost to eating your pollinators or your friends. We need both of those things to say that there is some sort of conflict going on here. So, as we established earlier, Venus flytrap is very good at not catching its own pollinators. Remember, there's that minimum overlap between the insects visiting the flowers and the insects getting caught in the trap. And you might look at the plant itself and say, well, it's obvious why. The flowers are about a foot above the traps. There's this really wide separation between the two. But what's tricky is, in general, if you're a flowering plant, it's frequently a good idea to have your flowers held quite high to be in the path of flying pollinators. So it's difficult to look at that trait and say, oh, is this an adaptation to not capture pollinators? Or is it an adaptation to just attract pollinators? What is the evolutionary sort of motivation for why this trait is as we see it? So there's a few different ways to get at the sort of reasons for that separation, and so what we looked at is we wanted to understand, is an insect more valuable as pollinator or as a prey? So if you accidentally capture your own pollinator, eat your own pollinator every once in a while, maybe that's not such a big deal because then you're getting a nutrient boost that may still help with your reproductive output. We were also interested to know who are the most effective pollinators of Venus flytrap. Different pollinators vary in how effective they are at pollinating different plant species. And maybe if you capture a pollinator, and when I mean you, I'm having you pretend you're a Venus flytrap. Maybe if you capture your own pollinator, it's not such a big deal if the one you captured was one that is not necessarily a very effective pollinator. So which of your friends are most worth not accidentally capturing? So to get at this, we wanted to understand how reproduction is limited by pollen versus how it's limited by prey. And to do this, we selected a number of Venus flytrap plants in the wild. tagged them and subjected them to two different, four different treatments that represented two different factors. Some of them got additional prey. So in this case, frozen crickets that we added to the traps and then gently massaged the traps to encourage them to take them. Some of them got supplemental pollen in the way I described earlier, hand pollinating the flowers. Some lucky plants got both supplemental pollen and supplemental prey, and some were left as a control. We didn't touch them, at least not providing pollen and prey. And we did this to understand, will we see a difference in reproductive output, and how differentially, how will that differ between these different treatments? At the same time we were doing this, we also wanted to understand, as I mentioned, which are the most effective pollinators. And so to get at this, we did this quite complicated, or at least to some people tedious thing, where we covered plants in the fields that were in bud, so before they'd started flowering, with those kind of like mesh organza bags that sometimes you get wedding favors in. And then when the plant flowered, we uncovered the flower and then observed it, waited for a pollinator to visit it. And then as soon as that pollinator visited, we collected the stigma and counted the number of pollen grains on the stigma. The idea being here, those pollinators that in a single visit leave more pollen could be considered more effective than those that visit and leave less pollen. Just so you are aware, many of you are already aware because you're probably working and breeding fly traps already, but flytrap pollen is pretty unique looking. And the case for sundews as well. Everyone in this family, they form these tetrads that you can almost see, with the naked eye. They're huge pollen grains, and that these grains are technically four stuck together in a tetrad. And when you look at a insect covered in these pollen grains, to me, like, they're so huge, they look like those little ping pong balls that actors cover themselves in when they're doing motion capture. They're huge, just really interesting. And so this is what we found from that supplemental pollen, supplemental prey study. So we did this in two different trials. We did one where we started it in fall of 2019, well before budding started, and then measured reproductive output in 2020. And then we did one where we started it in 2020 after the buds were initiated, and the same year looked at that reproductive output. And so for each of these graphs on the left is, so that vertical axis, that y-axis is the number of is an estimate of the reproductive output, how many seeds each plant produced. And then each graph shows on the left the reproductive output for plants that receive no prey, and on the right ones that receive supplemental prey. And then the red line are those that got no pollen, and the blue line is those that got supplemental pollen. So if you look at the difference between the left and the right of the graph, that gives you an idea of the difference in seed production between those that received prey and those received not. And you can see there is a difference, which was significant for the 2019 trial. As we might expect, those that received prey produced significantly more seeds than those that did not. If we wanted to see a difference in pollen supplementation for this reproductive output, we would expect these two lines, that red and that blue line, to diverge. But in this case, these lines are more or less parallel, or diverge, or be some distance away from each other. But in what we found, at least for this study, they're more or less parallel, where we observed pretty much no difference in reproductive output between those that received supplemental pollen and those that didn't. So in this case, the major factor deciding how much output a plant had was whether it got supplemental prey or not. And then in terms of the pollinator efficiency, we had an unfortunate instance where at the site we were working at, there was an apiary nearby. And if you're familiar, here in North America, honeybees are non-native. So we got tons of honeybee visits, but that doesn't necessarily represent sort of a wild scenario. Regardless, I still think we got some interesting information out of this. So in this case, that y-axis, that vertical axis, is the number of pollen grains we found on the stigma, and the x-axis is showing you all these different insect groups that we observed. and we got lots of honeybee visits, which I think is unfortunate. And honeybees outperformed sweat bees, which is what we consider to be one of their major natural pollinators. And while I wouldn't necessarily say this means, oh, we need to get honeybees on the landscape to pollinate flytraps, what was interesting is as we were watching this, we observed that these larger pollinators, honeybees and carpenter bees and things like that, they're so huge that when they are feeding on the flytrap, they're touching all the reproductive parts, the anthers and the stigma, and sort of like brushing their whole bodies over the flower itself and really making a mess in a way that probably could be more effective than these tiny sweat bees, which are sort of flying in, sometimes just sipping at the nectar itself, and then flying away, potentially sometimes not even touching the anthers. So I think there's potentially something here about body size that could provide clues about which pollinators are most effective for flytrap, though I think some more study needs to be done on this one to really tease this one out. We also didn't get any beetle visits, which was interesting. So we had to observe a beetle visit to one of our experimental flowers for it to count. We observed no beetle visits to our experimental flowers, but we would be sitting there and a beetle would visit one of our non-experimental, non-bagged flowers nearby. So it wasn't that the beetles were scared of us, it was bad luck. So this needs to continue in order to piece out like how good beetles are at pollinating Venus flytrap. So major conclusion from this, even after budding has started, reproduction is limited by prey capture. Those that got more prey produce more seeds. We didn't observe, at least for this study, that same effect for pollen, though we did observe it previously in that fire study. And although sweat bees are frequent visitors, maybe other pollinators have an outsized role in pollinating this plant based on body size. I just want to end up with some final sort of info and thoughts about Venus flytrap conservation. This is a rare plant. It's considered threatened by the state of North Carolina, but as you may be aware, there was a recent decision by the Fish and Wildlife Service to not list it under the Endangered Species Act. And some of the things they cited were it has resiliency under various climate and development scenarios, and there are a number of very large populations, which is true. There are about 70 some odd populations of Venus flytrap. We used to have 120 some odd. We're down to 70. But the vast majority of individuals are concentrated in just a few mega populations. So this bar chart is just showing the percentage of native flytraps that occur in each size population. And 98% of Venus flytraps are just in, I think it's like 6 populations, and 75% of native flytraps are in 4 populations. And I mention this just from a conservation standpoint as we're thinking about flytrap and its management in the wild, that it's a lot of eggs in just a very few baskets. So just because it hasn't been listed means there's still conservation implications we need to think of. And I say this so we can also bring our attention to some of the continuing initiatives to protect this plant, including an ongoing initiative to protect flytrap on private lands by this group called Venus Flytrap Champions. I think that website's worth checking out. There's ongoing demography studies by folks at Duke University, genetics at North Carolina Botanical Gardens, and mycorrhizal associations from folks at Coastal Carolina University. So continued studies of its ecology in the wild are very much underway. And I also like to, I mention this in every flytrap talk now because I think it's so fascinating. This plant is rare and obviously very precious to many different people, but I like to mention that it has a much, much rarer associate. The Venus flytrap cutworm moth has only been recorded approximately 40 times since the 18th century. As far as we're aware, this species of moth, the larvae feed almost exclusively on Venus flytraps. So it's very rare and it feeds on a rare plant, which probably explains why it's so rare. So when we're talking about conservation of a carnivorous plant in the wild, we're also talking about the conservation of everything that's associated with it. And this is just to point out these are kind of disconnected, but on this plant you can see some of the frass, some of the bug poop, and some of the little holes that have been chewed in this flytrap from the cutworm moth. And all of this together from the research that I participated in, and or my cat is making a mess behind me, and the cutworm moth, I bring this together to say that when we're considering land management for rare plants, where to burn, what lands to protect, we need to also consider their associates, their insect associates. Insects respond frequently in a different way to fire than carnivorous plants. So understanding sort of the whole ecosystem perspective is an important part of conservation. And with that, I will thank everyone who supported me as part of this research, my committee, all the field assistants and people who helped permit me. And if there is time, I know I spoke a little bit quickly. I would love to take any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Laurie. That was excellent. If people are interested in becoming a paid ICPS member, you can go to our official website, which is icps.clubexpress.com. And that is where you can become a paid member. And our general website that's open to the public is carnivousplants.org. And one of the benefits of becoming a paid ICPS member is that you get our quarterly newsletter called Carnivorous Plant Newsletter, and it has been around for 52 years. So we have been around for a very long time. And in addition to getting those beautiful full-colored newsletters that have scientific writings, field trip reports, cultivars, you get access to the last 50 years. So you can find out when certain plants were discovered and different things were discovered about carnivorous plants. One of our contributors came up with the definition of what is a carnivorous plant only in like the late 80s. So I like how Laurie mentioned that Linnaeus is heavy metal and hardcore, and I agree. But it took another 150, 200 years for people to really come to the consensus of what was a carnivorous plant. So here's some pictures of our beautiful newsletter. And something else that we're very proud of is that every August, from August 1 to August 31st, we have Carnivores in the Classroom grant for teachers K through 12, where we fund up to 50 teachers from all over the world with $150 worth of live carnivorous plants to be added to their classroom. Because people who are watching this, you probably remember the first time you learned about a carnivorous plant and how you were intrigued. And we want to promote botany. We want to promote carnivorous plant conservation. And we think a great way to do that is by hooking the kids in their K through 12 classrooms. And for 2024 to 2025, these are our sponsors. We had 6 carnivorous plant nurseries, and people from all over the world contribute live carnivorous plants to classrooms. And then in the middle, new this year, we partnered up with Carnivorous, and they specially made 5 3D carnivorous plants. You can go to our website, and if you have a 3D printer, or if you have access to a 3D printer, you can print these for free. And every teacher who got their shipment of live carnivorous plants also got to choose a 3D carnivorous plant that was shipped directly to them. Every other year, we have an international conference. In 2025, we don't have a conference, but in 2026, our conference is going to be in the Americas. It could be in North America, Central America, or South America. And we will be announcing that hopefully around May 2025. So you can plan your giant trip. B says, great talk and photographs. Thank you very much. And Bob says, you saw an increase in pollen in better fed traps. Is there a correlation between feed quantity and the number of flowers and frequency of the flowers?
Thank you. That's a good question. At one point, so I did weigh all these crickets and have a value of with for each plant how much we provided. And I did analyze that at one point, the number of flowers and number of seeds versus the weight of the prey. And I believe it was a positive correlation, more prey, more flowers, or at least in this case, I think it was more seeds. I don't recall what it was for the flowers. But yes, I'm having trouble recalling what we did, but I did try that analysis, and I believe it was straight. The more you give, the higher the output, though I'm sure there's a limit on that at some point when you get to the traps just rotting with too many insects in them or something. Um, but yeah, that's a great question.
So Laurie, we have a lot of young people who watch our videos, and I get these emails often, but I just got an email, I think earlier this week or at least last week, from a student at a community college interested in studying carnivorous plants, and they asked how can they get involved into studying carnivorous plants as a career. And I suggested they reach out to any botany professor anywhere in the world. Well, Laurie, could you maybe share your experience of how you can get into maybe a bachelor's degree or master's degree or a doctoral degree regarding like specific carnivorous plants? Because there isn't too many people at that level studying carnivorous plants.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just full disclosure, I tripped and fell into carnivorous plants. I didn't set about to go studying Venus flytrap. Strictly speaking, I'm a pollination biologist and entomologist. And so this was just the system I ended up with. But I would encourage people who are maybe in high school and an undergrad who are figuring out, how to get involved. It would be making connections with, groups like this one and figuring out names and who who to talk to and who might have opportunities. And if you have the opportunity to work as an assistant in the field or in a lab and get that research experience. That's a key part of it, whether in carnivorous plants or not, because if you understand what it is you're interested in about carnivorous plants, whether that's the morphology of the traps, or in my case, more of a plant pollinator sort of conservation lens, if you understand that aspect of it, you can work with people who are in those fields and then finagle your way into making it about carnivorous plants. In taxonomy, that would be a good one, getting in touch with folks who are working on the taxonomy if you want a more direct line, carnivorous plant line. So yeah, just being on the lookout for opportunities, learning all the time, and yeah, understanding what aspect of carnivorous plants interests you. But I did just I tripped into this world.
And if you're interested in like fire ecology of a carnivorous plant, you can just find a professor who's doing fire ecology generally and then say, oh, I'm interested in butterworts or pinguicula or drosera, and they might be interested in your angle of carnivorous plants. So the professor doesn't necessarily need to be already doing carnivorous plants.
Yeah, absolutely. If your interest overlaps with their interest and you cold call a professor and you're interested in doing research with them, frequently, they'll be receptive to that. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay, how easy is it to identify the prey of a Venus flytrap, thinking about the digestion process?
That's a really great question. I was actually minimally involved with the folks. It was right before I started. They did that prey analysis. And as you can imagine, especially caterpillars, just they become soup. And so for a lot of caterpillars, they would just look at a soupy caterpillar and say, this is a butterfly or moth. But as you may be aware, those crunchier things, they get digested, and when the fly trap opens up, there's an exoskeleton there. There's something to work with, and it's frequently very intact. So for adult arthropods, adult insects, it's fairly straightforward. It'll just be a crunched up version of that.
All right, well, thank you everyone for who attended this live. We have two more questions, but if you have any questions for Laurie, type them into the chat box below. Okay, is it, quote, easy to get permission to do a study regarding like manipulating the pollen for a vulnerable or an endangered species like the Venus flytrap?
Yeah, that's a good point. So it depends on the laws in your state or country. But frequently, what it means is um, finding out what regulatory agency governs plants in your country or state and getting a permit from them. And what activities they'll allow depends on the rarity of the plant and the nature of your activities. In my case, the state of North Carolina, the Plant Conservation Program governs the what we can do, collections from the wild of plants and things like that. I sent in a research proposal. They reviewed it, determined it would have minimal impact, and then approved from that. So there is a process for, and rightly so, for making sure that we're minimally impacting these plants in their native habitats.
Okay, I think this is the last question. Do you have the percentage of the overlap of the pollinators and prey? You know, you show those two
Yes, I don't
gray
have a number.
squares.
I don't have a number to pull from the top of my head, but if someone put a knife to my throat and told me to come up with a number, I'd say it's maybe 2%.
Okay.
And 2% of not major players. So yeah.
Very, very low. All right, well, thank you everyone who attended this live. And once again, thank you, Laurie. It was a fantastic presentation. I understood everything. Like nice, simple, but necessary science.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's not a surprise that gardeners, educators, and scientists are fascinated by these unique plants. The International Carnivorous Plant Society, or ICPS, not only love these plants, but welcomes growers just getting started all the way through professional scientists. The ICPS even started an annual World Carnivorous Plant Day to celebrate them. The free online event is held the first Wednesday of May. Take a look around our website and you'll find historic documents about carnivorous plants, growing guides, free educational resources, and more. Have questions? Ask. We don't bite, but our plants do.